There are two significant debates to consider when one thinks of Duncan Campbell Scott, the Canadian poet who also helped shape the country's destructive Indian policies that has had intergenerational ripple effects across many decades. First of all, do we just brush it off because that's simply how things were done back then, or retroactively prosecute this man in our history books? Secondly, can we still appreciate and even celebrate his art despite the traumas he helped to create for an entire race of people? These questions have been the subjects of debate for many decades now, as society tries to navigate through these sorts of moral dilemmas. But first we must understand exactly who Duncan Campbell Scott was and what it is that he did. Duncan Campbell Scott was born in the summer of 1862 in Ottawa, which was located in what was then known as the United Province of Canada, as this was still 5 years before the country officially became known as Canada. The son of a Methodist preacher, Scott studied at an English-language boarding school in Quebec and took to the piano in his spare time. Although he initially wanted to become a doctor, family finances were not sufficient, so he settled for working in the federal civil service instead, in 1879. Despite not being part of a wealthy society, Scott had acquired friends in high places, including Canada's first ever Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, a controversial figure himself. He remained in the same branch of government for the entirety of his career, although he worked his way up to the position of Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs by 1913. He retired in this same position in 1932. Scott's father, Reverend William Scott, would also later work in the Indian Affairs Department. Early off in his career in government, Scott began writing and even publishing his own poetry, his work appearing in a prestigious American magazine called Scribner's by the late 1880s. He even had two of his poems, Ottawa and At the Cedars, published in Songs of the Great Dominion, a pioneering anthology of Canadian poetry that was first published in 1889. Scott became prolific enough to even publish his own book of poetry, The Magic House of Other Poems, in 1893. He would write and publish 7 more volumes, up until 1935's The Green Cloister, by which time Scott was in his 70s. Scott would become one of this country's most acclaimed poets, with much of his pieces detailing Canadian places, Canadian people, and Canadian ways. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, Scott's literary reputation has never been in doubt. He has been well represented in virtually all major anthologies of Canadian poetry published since 1900. He is above everything a poet of climate and atmosphere, employing with a nimble, graphic touch the clear, pure, transparent colors of a richly furnished palette, wrote Scottish literary critic William Archer in his 1901 book, Poets of the Younger Generation. Ironically, some of Scott's most revered poetry describes the life of the Indigenous people with whom he is forever associated. Although they constitute a small portion of his total output, Scott's widely recognized and valued Indian poems cemented his literary reputation, says the Government of Canada's biography of Scott. In these poems, the bio continues, the reader senses the conflict that Scott felt between his role as an administrator committed to an assimilation policy for Canada's native peoples and his feelings as a poet, saddened by the encroachment of European civilization on the Indian way of life. In his role as Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, Scott was instrumental in implementing, as well as the continuation of, the destructive and immoral residential school system that resulted in substantial deaths of Indigenous children and trauma and survivors that would bleed into future generations, even to this day. He made amendments to the racist and harmful Indian Act in 1920, making it mandatory for all Indigenous children between 7 and 15 years of age to attend these schools. Although this system tore Indigenous families apart, stripped Indigenous people of their rights, and defined cultural genocide through aggressive assimilation practices, there are some people today who argue that this was simply how things were done back then, the common mindset of society in a different age. However, even in those days, Scott was aware of the damage this system, and others as well, had on the Indigenous population across the country. It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in these schools, and they die at a much higher rate than in their villages, Scott reported in 1910. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is being geared towards the final solution of our Indian problem. There is no doubt in my mind that Scott and everyone involved in the creation and implementation of the residential school system knew that it was at least immoral right from the start, if not dangerous as well. And even when it was clearly a danger to the Indigenous children, that did not stop them. As many as 150,000 Indigenous children were put through this system, which often included children being forcibly taken from their homes and then abused, raped, beaten, neglected, tortured, and experimented on by European colonialists at the hands of both the church and the government. Scott had written some of his most profound poems based on the very same culture he was helping to erase. His poetry has left a lasting legacy that remains even to this day, separate from his tarnished reputation as an advocate for assimilation, and as a man who stood by and allowed the atrocities of the Indigenous people happen under his own guidance. I think we've already established that the excuse of Scott's negative influence on Indigenous populations being of its time is unjustified, and that he and others were aware of the harm they were doing. However, when it comes to the question of whether or not one can appreciate Scott's poetry despite his harmful legacy, or separating the art from the artist, that is still up for debate. While I personally believe that one is morally capable of separating the two, and even appreciating and admiring art made by someone held in such disdain, and it is even considered by most scholars as the best way to approach all art, it is unfathomable to others. The reason why it's impossible to separate the art from the artist is because artists are their art, wrote Medium's Harshal Mada Naidu in 2023. Everything they create is an extension of themselves and a glimpse into their identity. Besides that, they are also posed to be significant for socio-cultural reasons, and artists also happen to be financially dependent on it. American literature lecturer Claire Hayes Brady offered another side in a 2019 article for Vox. For me, it's a false dichotomy, because this question presupposes we should want our artists to be virtuous, and that we should expect morality and ethical behavior from artists. I don't understand why we expect that, or why we would expect that. Whatever you think about novelist David Foster Wallace, who stalked and abused poet Mary Karr, it is certainly the case that he is a cultural touchstone. His work was important at a particular moment. As such, that justifies spending time studying it in critical and challenging ways with a critical eye. However you look at it, there's no denying that Scott should be remembered as a destructive figure in Canadian history, but also as an accomplished and praised poet, not necessarily in that order. Every individual must navigate their own moral meters and determine for themselves whether or not they can separate the art from the artist, or at least possibly understand the injustices of a different time and place. As for Duncan Campbell Scott in particular, for many, it is especially difficult to disconnect the man of his era and talent from his dark and lasting legacy of what can only be recognized as cultural genocide.
On the Way to the Mission by Duncan Campbell Scott. They dogged him all one afternoon through the bright snow, 2 white men, servants of greed. He knew that they were there, but he turned not his head. He was an Indian trapper. He planted his snowshoes firmly. He dragged the long toboggan without rest. The 3 figures drifted like shadows in the mind of a seer. The snowshoes were whisperers on the threshold of awe. The toboggan made the sound of wings, a wood pigeon sloping to her nest. The Indian's face was calm. He strode with the sorrow of foreknowledge, but his eyes were jewels of content set in circles of peace. They would have shot him, but momently in the deep forest they saw something flit by his side. Their hearts stopped with fear. Then the moon rose. They would have left him to the spirit. But they saw the long toboggan rounded well with furs, with many a silver fox skin, with the pelts of mink and of otter. They were the servants of greed. When the moon grew brighter and the spruces were dark with sleep, they shot him. When he fell on a shield of moonlight, one of his arms clung to his burden. The snow was not melted. The spirit passed away. Then the servants of greed tore off the cover to count their gains. They shuddered away into the shadows, hearing each the loud heart of the other. Silence was born. There in the tender moonlight, as sweet as they were in life, glimmered the ivory features of the Indian's wife. In the manner of Montagnais women, her hair was rolled with braid. Under her waxen fingers a crucifix was laid. He was drawing her down to the mission, to bury her there in spring, when the bloodroot comes and the windflower to silver everything. But as a gift of plunder, side by side were they laid. The moon went on to her settling and covered them with shade.